Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Associate Vice President, Academic Affairs, Dr. Joseph Paige, our Honorable Keynote Speaker, Professor Namata Blyden, the deans from all schools, faculty, staff, students, community members, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to this important occasion as part of the activities for the Black History Month, the signature event for that matter. The Amistad Lecture and Banquet are part of the Black History Month event organized annually by the Amistad Committee of the Center for Africana Studies at Central Connecticut State University. For those of us that are new to this event, I will take a moment to read the mission of the Amistad Lecture. The mission includes the following: to preserve and protect the history and legacy of the Amistad, to honor the experience and aspirations of the captives regarding human dignity, freedom, and social justice, to foster intellectual inquiry relating to the events of the Amistad through lecture and banquet series, workshops, research, and community outreach activities, and to celebrate the resiliency, the victory of the captives, as well as the enormous diversity in humankind. Notably, the towns of New London, New Haven, Hartford, and Farmington played prominent roles in the arrival, trial, and rehabilitation of the Amistad victims. Overall, the Amistad events of 1839 to 1842 and the aftermath constituted one of the most famous landmark civil rights cases in U.S. history, setting the stage for freedom, equality, and social justice for all mankind. For all practical and fundamental human rights purposes, the victory of the Amistad victims epitomizes the essence of social justice. However, several recent hate crimes and numerous discriminatory incidents in the 21st century are pointers to the fact that the struggle for social justice in America and the global society is far from being over. As claimed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter to fellow clergymen from the Birmingham jail on April 16, 1963, he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Hence, the struggle for social justice continues." Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to please rise with me to observe a moment of silence in remembrance of the lives of the Amistad captives and civil rights leaders who died in their struggle for fundamental human rights and social justice. These include Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., W.E.B. Du Bois, Rosa Parks, the Sojourner Truth, and several others. Please rise with me. May their soul rest in eternal peace, and their struggles not be in vain. Please be seated. I am Olusegun Sogunro, a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at this great university. With my colleagues on the committee, Dr. Emegwali, Dr. Beverly Johnson, Dr. Fumilayo, and Dr. Don Broad, we officiate the event tonight. I have the privilege to welcome Dr. Joseph Paige, the Associate Vice President, Academic Affairs, to bring a welcome address from the university. Please welcome Dr. Paige.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our provost, Dr. David Dowalder, and the Office of Academic Affairs, it's indeed my pleasure to welcome you to the Amistad Lecture and Banquet, which is always the signature event of Black History Month here at CCSU. I would just like to say that the Amistad Committee has had a long and well-respected history of bringing the most enlightening and relevant speakers to our campus, and I'm sure tonight the activities and events will be no exception. This year is the 16th annual Amistad Lecture that was initiated in 2002. The Amistad Lecture commemorates a historic event, the slave revolt on board the vessel, the Amistad, and the subsequent trial that took place in Hartford, Connecticut. The annual lecture recognizes Connecticut's unique place within that history and celebrates human dignity and freedom. It also uses the opportunity to highlight the work of a scholar on the African diaspora and to tease out the issues that still confront the African diaspora today. The Amistad is thus a metaphor for survival against the odds of justice and friendship. In this case, friendship and justice were rendered by those in Connecticut who agreed to fight in the case in support of the former captives. And I'm so honored that Dr. Sogunro has again asked my office to help sponsor and participate in this event, and as long as I am able to do, I will continue to do so. So please enjoy your meal, the activities, the speakers, and each other. Good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Paige. Please do not relent on your efforts in supporting Amistad morally and financially. Before this time next year, we are coming back to you. Continue to be a big brother. Thank you. The interim dean for the School of Education and Professional Studies is not here tonight, but we have the associate dean to bring some greetings from the School of Education and Professional Studies. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Mary Pat Bigley.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of Interim Dean Kim Costellas and all the faculty of the School of Education and Professional Studies, I just wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the CCSU Amistad Committee and the Center for Africana Studies for their hard work all year long, and especially for hosting this event tonight. This would not be possible tonight without all of your hard work and participation. This lecture tonight is important for us to continue to preserve and protect the history and legacy of the Amistad and honor the experience of the captives aboard the Amistad. As John Quincy Adams noted, we understand now We've been made to understand and to embrace the understanding that who we are is who we were. So I'll turn it right back over, and I thank you for this opportunity to say a few words this evening as we continue to work toward the universal aspirations for human dignity and freedom. Thank you again, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Ms. Bigley. We do appreciate your efforts to date, and I hope this time next year you'll be here and know how to remind our dean regarding the financial support, which is critical to our success. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Wolf, the Dean of College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Perhaps he's on his way. He will join us soon, I believe. Mr. Steve Klieger cannot be here tonight. He has other things going on. But we have the Associate Director for the Confucius Institute at CCSU, working together with the Center for Public Policy and Social Research. Please join me in welcoming Ms. May, the Associate Director of Confucius Center, to bring greetings.
Thank you, Professor Sugaru, my own professor. Greetings from the Center for Public Policy and Social Research and the Confucius Institute and O'Neill Endowed Chair. A warm welcome to Dr. Nemata Blyden, our distinguished guest speaker and professor of history from George Washington University. I am Mei Zongxiang. I'm the Social Director of Confucius Institute. Unfortunately, my boss, Steve Klieger, the director of our center and the Confucius Institute, could not join us this evening. He asked me to send his best wishes. I would also like to recognize our Chinese director, Tony Ma. Tony came from our CCSU sister university in China, which is Shandong Normal University. I am very delighted to have a part in this continuing, compelling Amistad Lecture series and extend my deep appreciation to the Amistad Committee and Africana Center for bringing this outstanding program to CCSU. Our center and our Confucius Institute are always seeking to work with other university programs and offices and departments to bring different voices and viewpoints to campus that may or may not otherwise be heard. And today's lecture promises to explore a little started but a compelling perspective on the legacy of the Amistad and its encounters in the Black world, and should prove quite enlightening. Like all of you, our center and the Confucius Institute recognize the importance of understanding this history to better understand and address the present, specifically the progress or lack of progress in the African Americans' centuries-old struggle for freedom, security, and socio-economic justice in this nation, and all its ramifications. To the end, we are happy to collaborate in this great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. May. We look forward to your support next year, and we really appreciate your contributions so far. Thank you. The president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples couldn't be here, but he has delegated Ms. Olga Calendar, the executive board member of New Britain chapter of NAACP. She is one of the first African American educators in New Britain. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Calendar to bring greetings from NAACP.
I bring you greetings on behalf of the New Britain branch of the NAACP. Hopefully, those words or letters, NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, but it really is for the advancement of all people, regardless of color. And the organization really, in a sense, mirrors why you're here today. With the Amistad, that was the first civil rights case in the United States, going to the Supreme Court. NAACP has been at the forefront of fighting for justice, voter rights, human rights, freedom for all people, no matter where or when. It is our sincere hope that if you are not a member, that you will become a member. And if you are in the New Britain community, we meet the second Tuesday of the month at OIC on North Main Street, New Britain, across from St. Anne's Church. The Amistad captives and its leader displayed great courage. That courage, hopefully, is not lacking in any of us today, because the fight and the problems continue, and we need everyone assisting, standing up, and doing whatever they can. So, greetings from the New Britain branch of the NAACP, and look forward to seeing you at one of our meetings in the very near future.
Thank you, Ms. Calenda. Ms. Paulette Fox from OIC, is she here? Maybe she will join us. But I'd like to introduce our Dean for College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who has been a great supporter of our events over the years. Dr. Robert Wolf, please step forward to bring greetings from your College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Please welcome Dr. Wolf.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first, I have to apologize. I wrote down the wrong time on my calendar. And so I walked in only to discover Dr. Paige telling me, you missed your cue. So it is indeed my great privilege to bring greetings on behalf of the Carol A. Ammon College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. And as a historian with a deep interest in the story of the Amistad and the Africans aboard that ship, it is a special privilege to be here. If you give a microphone to a historian, you never know what's going to happen, I think, right? But I'll tell you a very quick story. Slightly more than 20 years ago, getting ready to defend a dissertation on the social construction of whiteness in Baltimore and the role of racism in the history of that city. I flew out to Minnesota to defend my dissertation and found that the night before I had nothing to do. And so I thought, well, I teach in Connecticut now. Maybe I'll go see that Steven Spielberg film. And after that film, I decided someone had to teach a course on the Amistad so that we might get it right. I will just allow myself one observation. The history of the Amistad is a wonderfully complex tale filled with many, many stories. But it is first and foremost a story of the African diaspora. And I am greatly looking forward to hearing our talk this evening. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. We continue to appreciate your moral and financial support. And don't forget that before this time next year, we are coming back to you for financial support. Before we go further, I would like to introduce some dignitaries among us here, even though I cannot mention everybody's name, but I would like to mention the Dean for School of Engineering and Technology, as well as the Associate Dean, Dr. Zislo Kremes. And Dr. Olusegun Odeshino, the Associate Dean. Thank you for your annual support. And beside Dr. Odeshino, we have Dr. Peter Lemire, the Chair for the Department of Physics. Please welcome. Ms. Adwa Bandele Asante, the educator for Discovering America, Amistad, and she said they have a replica of the ship now, in case you would like to take a look. So this is at Mystic, Connecticut. She will tell us more about it before we leave tonight. So welcome and thank you. Other dignitaries will be mentioned as we go along. Ms. Paulette Fox. Without further ado, I would like to call on a member of the committee, Dr. Fumilayo Showers, Assistant Professor of Sociology, to please step forward to the podium and introduce our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Showers.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am so honored to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Nemata Blyden. Professor Blyden is an Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. She specializes in African and African diaspora history and has also researched women's issues in 19th century Liberia. She is no stranger to Connecticut and New England, having obtained her graduate degrees in history at Yale University and her bachelor's degree from Mount Holyoke College. She is the author of several articles on the African diaspora. She has also authored a couple of books, the following: West Indians in West Africa, 1808 to 1880, The African Diaspora in Reverse, and her most recent manuscript, recently completed manuscript, African Americans and Africans, A New History by Yale University Press, which will be available on Amazon in May. Professor Blyden has contributed a great deal to our understanding of the study of the African diaspora, in particular chronicling the complex relationships between African Americans and Africans on the continent. She is a true standout in the field. In addition to her intellectual contributions to the African diaspora, Dr. Blyden is a direct descendant of the great Pan-Africanist Edward Wilmot Blyden. Yeah. She embodies the spirit and legacy of the Amistad, and we're very honored to have her here at CCSU today. Personally, I am very proud to welcome a fellow Sierra Leonean and someone whom I view as a mentor and inspiration. She's just a fascinating person. I've had the honor of hearing a keynote speech that she gave at another event, and I can truly say that we're in for a very enlightening talk today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Nemata A. Blyden. How can I, all right, okay, I'll do my best to live up to that. I first want to apologize. I've just come off a flu and a cold, and I'm still recovering, so I hope that, you can hear me. I'd like to thank every one of you for coming. I didn't expect this many people,
and so I really appreciate it. I want to thank the Amistad Committee for inviting me to speak on this 180th anniversary of the Amistad Rebellion. It is indeed remarkable that almost 2 centuries after the brave act of 53 enslaved Africans on board a slave ship, we still remember their determination and quest for freedom at all costs. But we must also remember the struggles of the millions of African-descended men and women who preceded the rebellion and those who fought in its wake. My title for today is The Amistad, Diasporic Encounters in the Black World. All we want is make us free. 11-year-old Kali, a young boy, wrote these words to President John Quincy Adams on behalf of the African captives of the Amistad. These words and feelings of a child expressively convey the quest for freedom that the Amistad story represents. All we want is make us free. Variations of these words and the sentiments behind them have been used by men and women of African descent for more than 400 years. As they jumped off slave ships, escaped from slave barracoons and plantations, demanded rights in colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, struggled for equality in cities across the United States, and proclaimed that Black Lives Matter, what they were trying to communicate was, all we want is to make us free. Most of us are at least aware of how the story unfolds. In 1839, captured Africans on board a Spanish ship destined for Cuba revolted, killing the ship's captain. The leader of the revolt, Cinque, or Sengbe-Pie, a Mende man from Sierra Leone, attempted to have the ship sail back to his homeland. The ship drifted off the coast of New York, where it was impounded, and its occupants arrested in Connecticut. In the ensuing years, a landmark court battle was waged, resulting in the Africans being declared free by the United States Supreme Court in March 1841. In 1842, 35 of the captives sailed back to Africa. The rebellion aboard the Amistad was a part of what one historian has called a massive Atlantic wave of resistance to slavery. But it was much more than that. Coming in the wake of cries for liberation in the 1830s, Nat Turner's rebellion of 1831, Denmark Vesey's aborted insurrection in 1832, and the organization of the Underground Railroad, the Amistad Revolt was not the first, nor the last instance of men and women asserting their freedom. Yet the rebellion has retained a place in the diasporic imagination, conjured up by people of African descent through the centuries. While Black men and women in the years following the revolt might not have mentioned it by name, they articulated the same notions of liberation that prompted women, men, and children aboard the ship to rise up and force their enslavers to return them to their native land. Over the centuries, the story of the Amistad rebels and their successful suit for freedom has evoked different feelings in African-descended people who have invoked it to communicate their desire for freedom, for justice, and for equality. The Amistad Revolt and its aftermath has been the subject of countless imagery, books, plays, pamphlets, children's stories, and films. Images and representations of the event abound online. Today, I want to talk about the Amistad in terms of diasporic encounters and how it was used by men and women of African descent in the Atlantic world in their pursuit of justice and common cause. I'm thinking of diasporic encounters in terms of how Blacks in the diaspora and in Africa have engaged each other over the centuries, creating solidarity and sustaining historical, political, and cultural ties at different moments in history. Diasporic encounters and connections occurred over the centuries as men and women of African descent crossed the Atlantic in various directions. Yet these encounters were not always physical. The encounters between Africans in diaspora and Africa were also articulated in the imagination. I want to use the Amistad case as a connecting point to talk about these encounters and engagements between the continent and its sons and daughters in the Americas. The slave trade and enslavement, emancipation and ideas of freedom, justice and equality, and mobility and migration are at the heart of these encounters. What political, intellectual, and cultural exchanges took place among and between African-descended people in the Atlantic world, and why? We often focus on encounters of the late 19th and early 20th century generated by the Pan-African movement and decolonization. But interactions between Africa and its diaspora have persisted in various guises since Africans were enslaved and brought to the Western Hemisphere. On the continent, Africans made their first diasporic encounters with those who languished in slave forts on the coast, below the decks of slave ships on the Atlantic, and in slave pens in the Americas. In these spaces, they slowly began to think of themselves as having a common cause and destiny. Enslaved Africans continue to engage with their African homeland through the memories they carried with them, their religions, languages, cuisine, music, and remembrance of loved ones left behind. We know much about continuing ties between African-descended populations in the Americas with Africa, as they recognized and accepted the continent as part of their past. I would like to say a little bit about these diasporic encounters between African Americans in Africa and Africans in America. The Amistad case is a shared part of the heritage of African-descended population in the Americas and in Africa, allowing Black Americans to keep Africa in their consciousness. In the aftermath of the successful shipboard revolt, news of the Amistad Rebellion circulated among people of African descent, inspiring enslaved Africans to claim their freedom. In November 1841, the year the Amistad captives were declared free, enslaved Africans aboard the ship Creole, sailing from Virginia to New Orleans, revolted, forcing the captain and crew to take them to Nassau, Bahamas, where they were eventually freed by British authorities. In that year, Frederick Douglass was hired by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a full-time lecturer. It is clear that the high-profile case of the Amistad turned the tide with respect to attitudes towards slavery and the slave trade. It mobilized a flagging abolitionist movement, gave enslaved Africans the courage to resist their condition, and engendered conversations about human rights and Black liberation. While the Amistad captives were on trial, Black Americans, several generations removed from their African homeland, drew parallels between themselves and the captives, linking the events in Connecticut to the larger institution of slavery and its ramifications. Many used the spirit of the Amistad and the story of its captives to assert themselves in the United States. Black Americans, as they recognized the implication of its outcome, followed the trial with eagerness, wondering what it might mean for slavery in their country. The Black press covered the trial extensively, and frequent letters to the editor regarding the case were published. The Colored American, edited by Samuel Cornish and James McCune Smith, two prominent African Americans, reported on meetings held at churches and at other Black institutions to discuss the Amistad case. In January 1841, the newspaper published a letter of gratitude from the abolitionist Lewis Tappan, acknowledging, quote, receipt of $90 from the colored citizens of Cincinnati, Ohio, for the Africans taken in the Amistad. In April of that year, the newspaper recorded, quote, a meeting of congratulations held by the Black citizens of Buffalo, New York, for the purpose of expressing their gratitude for the liberation of the Amistad captives. The meeting hall, it recorded, was filled to an overflow as the African Americans celebrated. The gathering celebrated the, quote, intrepid act of Joseph Cinque, who preferred death rather than slavery, and concluded by adopting several resolutions and saying prayers for the liberation of the Amistad captives and the enslaved throughout the civilized world. Similar fundraising and celebratory events were held in Black churches all over northern cities. The many speeches and resolutions linked the plight of African Americans and Africans, and the efforts of those who contributed their hard-earned money to the cause of the captives allowed them to return to their native land. The congregants of Talcott Street Church in Hartford, right here in Hartford, for example, donated $9 to the cause, an amount which one historian has maintained may have been a greater portion of their collective income than any other church. In November 1841, the Amistad captives set sail for the British colony of Sierra Leone. In the 18th and 19th century, the Back to Africa movement occasioned a different kind of diasporic encounter, as many from the Americas made a reverse migration to places like Sierra Leone and Liberia. Africans in diaspora connected with Africa, believing they had much to offer the continent. They spoke of their duty to Africa, espoused ideas of providential design, and took on the role of spokesmen and women for the continent. Sierra Leone, with its multi-ethnic character in the 19th century, was an illustration of the possibilities for diasporic encounters between Africans and African-descended people in the Atlantic world. Indigenous Africans lived alongside liberated Africans freed from slave ships, and men and women from the Caribbean and the Americas who sought a better life in the colony. African Americans and West Indians from across the Atlantic brought their experiences to bear on the fledgling colony governed by the British. Sierra Leone was a small colony characterized by its diversity and multiplicity of African-descended people. Its origins were closely tied to British anti-slavery efforts, and its early history is marked by the determination of men and women once enslaved to assert their liberty. A little-known fact is that when Cinque and his compatriots arrived in Sierra Leone in January of 1842, the governor of the colony of Sierra Leone was a black man. William Ferguson, born on the island of Jamaica, had come to Sierra Leone as a doctor in 1814. In 1841, he was appointed to serve as acting governor of the colony. In December of that year, Ferguson was contacted by anti-slavery proponents in the United States for the safe reception of the Amistad survivors in Sierra Leone. Strongly opposed to the slave trade and slavery, Ferguson assured the captives' American benefactors that when they returned to Sierra Leone, they would be cordially received, adequately maintained, and provided for. He promised them safety from the threat of re-enslavement and a safe passage back to their homes. Alongside Ferguson, two other black men from the Caribbean held important positions in the colony. Robert Dugan, serving as Queen's Advocate, and the Trinidadian John Carr, Chief Justice of the colony. We can well imagine that Cinque and his compatriots felt a greater sense of security knowing that the men who governed the colony and were responsible for their legal protection were of African descent. Also in the colony when they landed were Edward Jones and Daniel Coker, African Americans who had settled in Sierra Leone. Jones, born in Charleston, South Carolina, was the first black graduate of Amherst College in Massachusetts. He graduated in 1826 and arrived in Sierra Leone in 1830. Serving as a teacher and missionary, he worked tirelessly on behalf of Africans. As the Amistad case was coming to a close in the United States, Edward Jones was answering questions in front of a parliamentary committee, urging the British government to encourage African agency in their own affairs. He would later become the first black principal of the first institution of higher learning in Sierra Leone, Frabbe College. Daniel Coker was born Isaac Wright in Maryland. In 1816, along with Richard Allen, Coker founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Faced with discrimination and believing that blacks had little chance of achieving equality in the United States, he accompanied the first group of settlers bound for what would later become Liberia in 1820. Coker wrote of his desire to proselytize among Africans and prayed that he would, quote, be true to my trust and to act for the good of my African brethren in all things. I feel a great responsibility to rest upon me. Upon arrival, he exclaimed, thank the Lord, I have seen Africa. Writing back to friends in the United States, he spoke of his connection to the continent. My soul cleaves to Africa, he extolled. It is a good land. It is a rich land. Coker remained in Sierra Leone where he worked as an educator until his death. The desire to work on behalf of Africans characterized the Christian zeal of African American missionaries, who engaged in another kind of diasporic connection with Africans. The establishment of the United Brethren in Christ missions in Sierra Leone was another consequence of the Amistad Rebellion. However we may feel about that endeavor today, an understanding that missionaries were often implicated in the colonial enterprise, many men and women of African descent took on the mantle of Africa's uplift, serving as missionaries in Africa. United Brethren missionaries Joseph and Mary Goma arrived in Sierra Leone from Ohio in 1870 and stayed for 22 years. They took their obligation to Africa seriously, working tirelessly in the community, and were known to have good relationships with local African leaders. Writing home in 1886, Joseph wrote, "We love Africa and we love the work." This was a sentiment expressed by other African-descended individuals over the centuries. This was the world to which the Amistad survivors returned, and while most of them disappear from the historical record, and that includes Cinque, their ordeal would be raised up as examples of women and men who would rather die than give up their freedom. African Americans in particular recognize the effectiveness of emphasizing this historical event. Years after the trial ended, the captives' actions would be cited by African-descended men and women in their quests for liberation. Luminaries of African American history drew attention to the Amistad case to condemn slavery, call for African American liberation, and underscore Black achievement. In 1843, Henry Highland Garnett, the outspoken Black abolitionist and founder of the African Civilization Society, spoke of, quote, "the immortal Joseph Cinque, the hero of the Amistad. He was a native African, and by the help of God, he emancipated a whole shipload of his fellow men on the high seas. And he now sings of liberty on the sunny hills of Africa and beneath his native palm trees, where he hears the lion roar and feels himself as free as that king of the forest." In 1859, the Frederick Douglass newspaper covered a meeting of the African Civilization Society held at Shiloh Presbyterian Church. The society, whose motto was, "No man should deprive me of my love for Africa, the land of my ancestors," unmistakably pronounced its relationship to the continent. To an audience of Black Americans and Africans from the continent, the church's pastor, Reverend J.B. Smith, called on Black Americans to condemn the recently passed Dred Scott decision denying African Americans citizenship rights. Smith called for Black unity and for African Americans to love Africa and honor it. Also present was James W. Pennington, who, recalling his activism during the trial of the Amistad captives, remarked that he was, quote, "glad to see colored men interested for Africa." James Pennington was to a great extent a son of Connecticut. Born enslaved in Maryland, he escaped north, becoming an ordained minister, an outspoken critic of slavery, and champion of Black voting rights. In Hartford, he pastored the Talcott Street Church, now Faith Congregational, and was involved in the abolitionist movement. Pennington organized efforts to help the Amistad captives, raising money and awareness. He was instrumental in the establishment of the American Missionary Association, whose members accompanied the captives back to Sierra Leone, and which would later merge with the United Brethren Church, under whom the Gomas served. In 1840, Pennington was elected president of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. He continued advocating for the rights of people of African descent until his death. The diasporic connections Pennington created with the captives of the Amistad were instrumental in his understanding of his ties to Africa. 60 years after the rebellion, the Cleveland Gazette would once again place Pennington's name alongside Cinque in an article that listed both men as men who made history. The opinions espoused by Pennington, Smith, and Garnett continued to influence men and women in the African diaspora to speak out against slavery, take pride in their African ancestry, and work on behalf of the continent and its people. Many heeded that call. One such person was the Pan-Africanist Edward Wilmot Blyden. In the 19th century, my great-grandfather left his birthplace in the Danish Virgin Islands to settle in Liberia. Edward was 7 years old when Cinque and his compatriots took over the ship. While 11-year-old Callie sat in a Connecticut cell, young Blyden was training to follow in his father's footsteps as a tailor. John Knox, an American minister on the island, saw potential in the bright, precocious boy whose keen mind and facility for languages set him apart. In 1850, Knox arranged for 18-year-old Blyden to attend Rutgers Theological Seminary, but he was denied admission on account of his race. In 1850, that year, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, requiring Northerners to return men and women escaping slavery and claiming their freedom. Fearful of the possibility of being enslaved, Blyden took the opportunity offered to African Americans to go to the colony of Liberia in 1820, founded in 1820. There, the boy destined to be a tailor thrived and finished his studies. He was instrumental in founding Liberia College and later served as its president. He represented Liberia as Secretary of State and Minister of the Interior, and was the country's ambassador to the Court of St. James in Britain. Throughout his life, Blyden championed the cause of African-descended people. He made early, if not the first, use of the concept of an African personality and encouraged racial pride. The African, he wrote, must advance by methods of his own. While to my knowledge, he did not refer to the rebellion by name, Blyden was well aware of the devastating effects of the slave trade, which the Amistad captives had resisted. He described the feelings of insecurity and fear of enslavement produced in Africans as they fled their homes in attempts to escape slave hunters. Shall we here tell you of the sufferings which the slave trade has entailed upon them? Shall we tell you of their sorrows in the countries of their captivity? Oh, we would not harrow up the feelings of this audience with tales of woe. We would but refer to slavery and the slave trade. Those names alone are sufficient to call up emotions of sympathy wherever there exists the feelings of humanity. He pointed to the adverse consequences of racism and slavery on the psyche of Black people and urged Blacks to discountenance as much as possible this servile feeling and to use every means to crush it wherever it appears, for its influence on the mind and morals and general progress of the race is fearfully injurious. Responding to depictions of Africans as intellectually inferior, Blyden drew attention to the achievements of African Americans, naming Henry Highland Garnett, whose eulogy he gave when the Garnett died, Frederick Douglass, Daniel Payne, Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the physician and abolitionist James McCune Smith, and Francis Watkins, who he called the poetic genius of Baltimore. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a fervent abolitionist who witnessed the consequences of slavery in her native Maryland and vowed to fight against it. She was 14 in 1839 when the Africans aboard the Amistad revolted. In that year, she published her first poem in an abolitionist publication, and we might wonder whether she too followed coverage of the trial. In poems such as Bible Defense of Slavery, The Slave Mother, and The Slave Auction, she condemned those who participated in the enslavement of Africans. The slave mother she portrays might have been young Kali's. She is a mother, pale with fear. Her boy clings to her side. They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, never more may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. She is a mother, and her heart is breaking in despair. The Slave Auction describes the moment when men, women, and children were sold, and mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants bartered them for gold. The poem Ethiopia called for the emancipation of African-descended people, while Bury Me in a Free Land articulated the desire of millions of enslaved Africans to achieve freedom in death. Make me a grave wherever you will, but not in a land where men are slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to the shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair. Just as the Amistad captives had voiced a wish to die rather than be enslaved, Watkins wrote, "My rest shall be calm in any grave, where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of the passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves." This pursuit of liberty, so heart-rendingly communicated, is a lasting legacy of the Amistad captives, one taken up by African-descended people for centuries after. The Amistad would continue to live on in the memory and imagination of Black people. In 1939, to celebrate the centenary of the rebellion, a mural painted by African-American artist Hallie Woodruff was dedicated at Talladega, a historically Black college in Alabama. The three panels representing the revolt, the court scene, and Back to Africa show in beautiful, bold colors the struggles and triumphs of the Africans. Likewise, in the 1960s, the Amistad Society, a committee on Black history and culture in Chicago, sponsored Black history workshops for African Americans where participants read books and articles on the Black experience. The Society's intent was to educate African Americans about the history they had not been taught and to combat what the paper reported was the lack of a proper consideration of the role of the Negro in American history. The many workshops organized by the Society tackled topics such as heritage, the African background, as well as lectures on the topic of Pan-Africanism and the African personality. In October 1963, the Society sponsored a panel discussion entitled Relationships, Africa and the American Negro. The panelists were Malcolm X, Homer Smith, a journalist, and Chimere Ikoku, president of the Pan-African Students Organization in the Americas. This pursuit of knowledge is a lasting legacy, and the Amistad story has been used in concrete and constructive ways to promote an agenda for inclusion, Black liberation, and new diasporic encounters. Contemporary attempts to use the legacy of the Amistad Rebellion for positive change and inclusion remind us of what the struggle for freedom can engender. In 2002, two African-American legislators from New Jersey sponsored legislation to include and integrate African-American history in New Jersey school curriculums. The Amistad Bill became law, and an Amistad Commission was established to make sure the contributions and history of African Americans are comprehensively taught in New Jersey classrooms. Likewise, in 2005, Illinois established an Amistad Commission to, quote, promote education and awareness of slavery and the African slave trade. The act boldly states, it is the policy of the state of Illinois that the history of the African slave trade, slavery in America, the depth of their impact in our society, and the triumphs of African Americans and their significant contributions to the development of this country is the proper concern of all people, particularly students enrolled in the schools of the state of Illinois. So I'm going to extrapolate here and point out that Illinois is also Barack Obama's state, home state. Today, a search for the Amistad on the internet generates references to artwork, centers, films and documentaries, programs, archives, legislation, and even annual lectures named after the events of 1839. The Amistad Research Center in Louisiana houses one of the largest collections of documents on the Black experience, while the Amistad Center for Art and Culture here in Hartford showcases the art and history of African Americans. Here at CCSU, this annual Amistad Lecture, established in 2003, is to, quote, preserve and protect the history and legacy of the Amistad, honor the experience of the captives aboard the Amistad, and relate the events to the universal aspirations for human dignity and freedom. This major historical event continues to be a source of pride for African-descended people in the Atlantic world. for Sierra Leoneans at home and abroad, particularly in the United States, stressing their connection to the case has been fruitful. The Amistad story, popularized, however we might think about it, by Steven Spielberg's movie, many of us don't feel too well, led to Sierra Leonean involvement in projects promoting their country's history and linking it to the events of the 1840s. Sierra Leoneans were part of the Amistad research project that led to the erection of a monument in New Haven, and Sierra Leonean immigrants in the United States organized events surrounding the recreation of the schooner and were part of the celebration when it finally sailed with an African-American captain in 2000. The captives were largely Mende, but all Sierra Leoneans laid claim to the Amistad history. African Americans, too, have claimed the Amistad. In 2008, the African American actor Isaiah Washington, having been linked by DNA tests to Sierra Leone, wrote of his pride in his African ancestry. But the thing that interested me most, he wrote, was Sengbe Pie, or Joseph Cinque, the Mende leader that led the revolt on the slave ship La Amistad. I said, wow, this guy is one of my ancestors. What now? My answer? I decided to go see the country and Sengbe Pie's people, my people, for myself. Washington visited Sierra Leone and subsequently established a foundation to aid in Sierra Leone's development. Others continue to invoke the Amistad to call for justice, equality, and a recognition of their humanity and human rights. I want to conclude by ruminating on those aspirations, on how we can think about the Amistad and diasporic encounters today. The sacrifices of the Amistad captives and those who struggled for Black liberation have largely paid off. African-descended people have made great strides in the almost 200 years since the revolt. African Americans have moved into the 21st century with many of the same struggles they have lived with since 1839, but have also made tremendous progress in attaining citizenship and independence. Yet arguably, they have not achieved full acceptance and equality in the country to which their ancestors were forcibly brought. In recent years, high-profile cases of aggression towards Black citizens have resulted in diasporic encounters of another kind. Shocked and outraged, African-descended people have organized in protest movements condemning the treatment of Blacks regardless of where they are in the world. The three women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement explained, "We see ourselves as part of the global Black family, and we are aware of the different ways we are impacted or privileged as Black people who exist in different parts of the world." African immigrants in the United States have been part of this activism, as have other immigrants of color. In a country still troubled with racial issues, and where people of African ancestry are economically disadvantaged and constructed in negative ways, diasporic encounters are taking place on American soil, as African-descended people engage with each other, creating and sustaining historical and political ties. Historically, the diasporan gaze looks to Africa during moments of anxiety, political exclusion, and constraints on civil liberties in the American homeland, whether it be segregation, discriminatory laws, or violence. Are we in such a moment? There is certainly evidence of increased racial profiling, microaggressions, and what one newspaper report on the profiling of an African graduate student at a university in this very state, and my alma mater, I might add, has characterized as persistent racial divisions in the United States. As the population of African-descended people in America becomes more diverse, conversations about who can claim an African-American identity are going on. I fear this is a distraction. In 1839, Black men and women in the United States recognized their commonality and shared aims with the Amistad captives, and their activism was largely responsible for the Africans' freedom, to a large extent. When Kina, one of the captives, spoke to an African-American church, exclaiming, "You are my brethren, the same color as myself," he recognized that what united them was what they looked like, their Blackness. African-descended people have seen the value of these diasporic encounters. What, for example, accounts for the overwhelming response to the Black Panther movie in 2018 and its tremendous reception by African-descended populations. The many pictures on social media showing blacks in the United States wearing dashiki, kente, ankara, and other imagined African clothes to screenings of the film is testament to the fact that diasporic connections, while they may lay dormant, are ready to resurface. African American desire for ties with Africa may have waned with the end of segregation, the gains of the civil rights movement, and greater integration of Black Americans in the United States, but the connection to the continent remains. Diasporan encounters in our age have taken on an urgency reminiscent of an era when men and women of African descent had little or no rights. Why, in the wake of the election of the country's first Black president, which to many signaled full integration, do we have a hugely successful movie that stoked Black American pride in Africa, prompting inquiries, not all in jest, about how to get to Wakanda? Perhaps the film's release coincided with a larger despair about the promise of America. Perhaps the fictional Wakanda symbolized a world of equality and freedom that many feel have eluded them. Perhaps it promised a safe haven from violence. Perhaps it represented a free land to be buried. In one of the film's final scenes, the African-American Killmonger, dying in the hands of his African brother T'Challa, pleads with his last breath, "Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ship, because they knew death was better than bondage." But the men, women, and children aboard the Amistad did not jump from the ship. They captured it. They believed that life was better than death and that liberty was better than bondage. They chose instead to fight for freedom, leaving that legacy for a successive generation of African-descended people. That yearning still beats in the hearts of their descendants today, the longing so desperately conveyed in the words of a child. All we want is make us free. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, without doubt, you agree with me that Dr. Blyden has given an outstanding reflection related to the diasporic encounters in the Black world. Can we give her another round of applause, please? I would like to call on an expert, historian for that matter, to put the reflections in an academic context. Please help me to welcome Dr. Daniel Broad to the floor. Applause, please.
Cheers. What a fantastic talk by Dr. Blyden. I assure you that the individuals that are leaving are going to class. They have evening classes. I assure you. Yeah. they have class. But with that being said, what a fantastic, brilliant lecture. I thank you for connecting the Amistad to the pursuit of justice and equality to other Blacks in the diaspora, also to connecting Africans to Blacks in the Caribbean, the United States, and other locations. We know that Blacks in the diaspora have both sides of the Atlantic pulling at them. One side begging them to remember, and the other side begging them to forget. And that is a conflict in and of itself. Also, for addressing individuals like William Highland Garnett, Frederick Douglass, James W. Pennington, and last but not least, connecting the Amistad to Black Panther, right? And Afrofuturism. So with that being said, I would like to open up to the audience an opportunity to ask you questions, and I welcome you back to the podium. any questions for Dr. Blyden?
I work with young students and I tell the story of the Amistad Africans for a living. And I just want your opinion on a good response to. I have my own, I've worked on it, but oftentimes an adult in the room will highlight the fact, well, Africans sold themselves into slavery. They like to highlight that point. And I'm just curious as to how you respond when people want to underscore that aspect.
And of course, it's not an easy answer, and how to simplify it for children is hard, because we find that problem with our students as well. And so I always start my classes by saying there is no Africa. Right? Africa is a constructed in a sense, right? So what we call Africa is a place that was named by outsiders. People within did not consider themselves Africans in the way we think about it. So I think the Pan-African notion of Africans that we've developed since maybe the end of the 19th century, 20th century, is very different from the way that Africans during the period of the slave trade saw themselves. And yes, while there may be cases of Africans selling themselves, people who looked like each other but had no relations, connections, cultural ties, religious, political ties, participated in the slave trade selling others, right? And you still have to go deeper and make it more complex. But perhaps for a child of the level that you're talking about, that might be sufficient. Yes, ma'am. And Gloria, thank you. Right.
People don't know.
Trafficking, yeah.
And I think if you recognize that, if you look at that concept and look at the fact that, we've had to battle with human trafficking across the centuries. I mean, it's taking place right now.
Right.
There's even somebody in Florida who has been indicted for somehow getting involved in human trafficking. So it's a scourge and that we have to be aware of. And I think that point has to be thrown in. But it's a whole complex situation too.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer.
Because if you're going to do this, you've got to start to talk about the fact that in the African context, you're dealing with city-states, kingdoms, empires, and you have also rival competitors, something that is not unknown to European history. You have the British and the French. I think they did about 100 wars, right?
But we never talk about them as Europeans.
and so on. So if you look at it that way too, you would realize the complexity of, competitive states and state systems. And once you look at it that way, you've got to get it right. Now, the other thing too is that you've got to realize that we are also dealing with the question of prisoners of war too. And some people use the word and say, oh, slave, this and that. But really, to a large extent, we have prisoners of war who were caught up in these, competitive city-state systems and whatnot, who would be also, if you want, victims of this situation. And I think if you've studied the Vietnam War, you know what a prisoner of war is. You know that phenomena of the prisoner of war is also something which, in terms of international context, is a reality. One way or the other, good or bad, it's bad actually. But so you've got to look at the concept also of the prisoner of war. Because it is the prisoner of war, I would say the majority of the people who would be caught up in this situation would be in that context. But I realize that sometimes historians throw that bit of international, that conceptual analysis out of the window because they only want to talk about this, other entity. So, you know what you said about historians, they like to talk too much. So,
Oh, yes.
One last question to just to connect our lecture from last year. We had Dr. Karachi from Howard University come in to talk about the Creole. And I just wanted to know, of all the kind of rebellions that happened throughout the African diaspora, why is the Amistad so lionized and remembered?
So I'm not a scholar of Amistad, full disclosure. And the point he's making, of course, is there were other shipboard revolts, and why the Amistad has remained sort of the representative one. Perhaps because it was successful. I mean, the Creole was successful, but I think it wasn't quite as big in terms of its reach, right? And it, I mean, it didn't help that there was John Quincy Adams, at the center of that story, and the white abolitionists. So I think that's a large part of why that has remained in the consciousness, and also because it was on American soil, right? Creole, they get freed in the Bahamas, but it's an American soil at a moment in our history, right, where the anti-slavery movement is getting off the ground. African Americans are speaking out. The abolitionist movement, Garnett, Douglas are all speaking, and so the attention is on the case. And that's my take. Again, not as a scholar of the Amistad, but that's my take. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Well appreciated. Our keynote speaker wants you to know that there's a book which he has written that is coming out in May on Amazon.com. It's titled African Americans and Africa, A New History. So stay tuned for that. We shall continue with our program just before dinner. We'd like to call on Dr. Beverly Johnson, the Associate Professor of English and former Chief Editor, The Sojourner Truth, to read to us a well-crafted poem related to Amistad. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Blyden, for a very informative lecture. Appreciate that. Let's give her another round of applause, please. So for this particular poem, I thought about what I wanted to convey, and it's just ironic that so many of the messages today are connected to the title. And it's a poem that I wanted to really capture the leadership and the courage of the Amistad people, and I dedicate this poem to them and to musicianal legend in Zimbabwe and throughout the diaspora, Oliver Mtukudzi. So the poem is called Saving Ourselves. Please do not take it easy, for we must be very alarmed. We must conquer this unthinkable challenge so we can weather this precarious storm. No, our courage will never fail us in the victories that we seek, for it's better that we all perish than to ever consider defeat. This is our story of cultural courage. It infuses us with an endless will to fight our way through a global maze with cultural instincts as our shields. These instincts are powerful protectors from those who do not really know themselves, trying to inject their beliefs in our veins or infiltrate versions of their hell. But our instincts are constantly alerting us to question and to reject what we do not trust, to view our threats as realistic opportunities that will strengthen and preserve our cultural legacies. We believe that our culture is infinite and will remain forever so. It is the framework for our survival, revealing the secrets we need to know. Blessed with the original DNA from our precious ancestral lands, we define our destiny the most when in unison we stand. So let the threats come as they may, for the enemy will strike at will. Our cultural instincts will shield their blows and allow our spirits to heal. Our story, the Amistad story, represents the love of African culture and is told repeatedly for this world to know. We will continue to steer ourselves in the right direction, just as far as we wish to go. Thank you.
As always, excellent poem over the years. Can we please give Dr. Johnson another round of applause? Thank you very much. Leadership and courage of the Amistad captives. Before we go to having something to bite, I just would like to recognize some people among us so that we do not lose sight of that. Dr. Olga Petkova from the Computer Sciences, please. Dr. Amis Michael from Department of Mathematics and executive member of Jamaica Educator Development Support Network, JETSIN. My professional colleague, Dr. Wangari Gichiru. Ms. Pat Gardner, the Associate Director for Admissions. We have some, Professor Steve Bakran from philosophy. Where is Dr. Bakran, Steve? Okay, he was here a few minutes ago. And we have several people from the community, but a few names that I have right here. I have Mr. Victor Cristofaro, principal from Outfall Public Schools. Welcome. From the community, again, we have Mr. Shupo and Mrs. Badebo. Mr. Babajimi Oniorisa. Mrs. Adeyemo. Other names will be announced as they get to me. We have to go in a particular order so that we become more orderly. We have enough food, more so that some students have left. So we have enough to eat, extra. So our keynote speaker will take the lead and we go from this table. Oh, point of order here, perhaps I'm feeling hungry and I try to, in recognition of the great work of our keynote speaker, I will call on my colleague, the co-chair of Amistad, the mother of Amistad, Dr. Gloria Emegwali, to please step forward and present an award to our keynote speaker, Dr. Emegwali. Join me in welcoming Ms. Tammy Denise for historical reenactment. Ms. Tammy Denise, pay attention, she's coming from the back to the front. Over to you, please.
Tu n'as pas encore vécu en cœur, tu as voyagé par avion. You see, that is the feeling I get each time I fly in that there sky. You see, when I am high in that sky, I am free. I am free to be me. I am far from discriminating restraints and even farther from racial complaints. But you see, I did not always feel this way, because where I am from, my kind, we're not allowed to dream. But you see, we were only supposed to do the bidding of the white man. We were supposed to take care of his children, wash his laundry, and pick his cotton. But you see, I dared to dream, and it is because of my mother that I dared to dream. I will take you back to the beginning. I was born in January 1892 in Waxahachie, Texas. I was one of 13 children. My mother was a former slave, and she, although could not read or write, she would encourage us children to learn to read and write, to be somebody. But I would oftentimes ask my mother, how could I be somebody when I am here in these cotton fields? From sun up to sundown, I am picking cotton. I did get relief when I would go to school, when I was allowed to go. I would gladly walk that 8-mile round trip to that little one-room shack where I would learn to read and I would learn to write. And every summer, my mother would rent books from the library wagon. And there in the year of 1903, I would learn that the Wright brothers, they had been credited with creating this thing called an aeroplane. I was quite fascinated with the idea to be able to fly in the sky in the heavens with the birds. But you see, I had to pick cotton. But oftentimes when I was picking that there cotton, I would sit down and I would look up into that sky and I would wonder what it would be like to be free. As time would go on, my mother would constantly continue to remind me that I was somebody and that I would be somebody. And that day finally came when I was somebody, for you see, I was able to go to school. I was the first in the neighborhood to do so, the first in my family. Now, each harvest season, my mother, she would have this jar that she called a special day of sunshine or a special day of rain. After each cotton picking season, she would turn in this cotton where she knew she was being cheated because no one ever treated her fairly. And because she was a black woman, she could not count, she could not read, but she would manage to save money in this jar. And I would be able to take advantage of that savings for one day when I graduated from school, all came together for this great party to celebrate. We would have fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, sweet potato pie, and lemonade. It was a wonderful occasion. And while everyone celebrated, Mama brought me into the house and she pulled out this special jar and she poured the contents on the table. You see, it was enough money for me to go off to college. I could leave these cotton fields behind. I was excited, but I was also a little sad because I would have to leave my family behind. But soon, I would board that train and I would head for that school in Oklahoma. And there, I would learn so much more. I learned how to take whole numbers apart and put them into pieces and put them back together. I would learn about the women in France who were flying these aeroplanes that I had learned about. But I also had learned about 53 people who were called slaves, but I dare say that they were captives who were stolen from their homeland. I called them brave, but you see, I would need to be just as brave as they were. For the time had come when I would have to leave this school that I had took such comfort in. The money I thought my mother had was enough for school. It was, but for less than 2 semesters. So the dean called me to his office and he says to me, "How do you like school, Bessie?" And I said, "I love it here. I am learning so much." He says, "We love having you here, but unfortunately, you do not have enough money to stay." And with those words, I would be headed back to the cotton fields of Texas. Now, want to belong in the tooth. I made myself a promise that I would only be in the cotton fields for a short period of time, and then I would be gone, never to return. But little did I know, it would be 7 long years before I would be able to leave the cotton fields. It happened one sunny, hot day. Word had come that Jesse Washington, he was 18 years old, not quite a man, but no longer a child. He was slow in his thought, but yet and still, he was accused of touching the farmer's wife. They snatched him from his mother's shack, they beat him within inches of his life, and then they lynched him at the edge of town on the tree to remind us of our place. But I tell you, I knew my place, for as his body was set ablaze, my place was no longer in the cotton fields. My place was to be free from all of this. And so I told my mother that I had to go. And she knew that the time would come that I could not be confined by these cotton fields. So as I boarded the train, I sat down on the side that, of course, I was not supposed to sit on. For you see, there was the Negro-only cars and the white-only cars. But in my mind, I paid the same amount of money that they paid, so I should be able to sit wherever I please. And so I chose to sit over here. And so I sat down. And I gazed out the window at my future, for I was going to Chicago. My 2 older siblings, Walter and John, they fought in the Great War, and they would write to me and tell me that I should come to Chicago. And so I was finally headed to Chicago. And as I sat and gazed out the window and thought about my future, why, there was the conductor. He's looked down upon me and he says, "Gal, what are you doing?" I looked up at him boldly and smiled. "I'm going to Chicago." Now, I knew that was going to cause me problems, but I did not care. So he looks down at me and he says, "Nigga, gal, do not sass me. Get up and go where you belong." I refused to move because, again, I paid the same money. So he would go and get one of his helpers, and they would help me out of my seat. But as I stood up to go back to the back, I stood with pride, and I stood with my shoulders straight and my head held high. For I knew that someday, my kind, we would not always have to sit in the back. But as I walked away, those that surrounded me, they applauded for me, giving me all the more courage that I needed to go sit where I did not wish to sit. But finally, I would arrive in Chicago. It was a whole different world. There were tall buildings everywhere. There were people who looked like me, dressed in the finest of wares. The women wore beautiful dresses. The men had on dapper suits and those shoes. Oh, I had never seen such. But as I looked around, I noticed something was missing. There were no cotton fields. There were no cotton fields where I would never pick cotton again. As a matter of fact, I chose to wear linen as my article of clothing. Now, I would get work at the White Sox barbershop. That is where my brother and others would meet, and I would meet some very prominent people of the time and in the area. Mr. Robert Abbott, you know him, right? He's the owner of the Chicago Defender. That is a newspaper that lets us know what is going on within the black community. And then there was Mr. Jesse Binga. He was the first black man to own a bank on the south side of Chicago. There was Ethel. She was the actor. Oh, there were so many. But oftentimes, my brothers would come in, and they would talk about what was happening in France, how the women not only worked on the airplane, but they flew them. So I became fascinated all the more. I wanted to be the world's first Negro aviatrix. So I told my brothers that that's what I wanted, but they laughed. They did not think that I could do it. I knew that they loved me, but they did not support my dream. So one day while I was working with Mr. Abbott, giving him his polished nails, as I always did, he asked me what was wrong. And I hesitated because I did not wish for him to laugh at me too. But he says, "No, Bessie, tell me, this is not you." So I told him, "I want to learn how to fly. I want to be the world's first Negro aviatrix." And instead of laughing, he would help me. He would go about trying to find a school that would teach me how to fly. Time would go by, but each time he came, the answer was always no. No one wanted to teach me how to fly because I was either a woman or I was a nigger. But I was not going to give up. I wanted to fly. And then one day he came into the shop so excited. He says, "Bessie, I found someone who's going to teach
teach you how to fly. I was so excited. He said, but you have to go to France. And I thought about it. I can't speak French, but that did not stop me. I got another job at a chili parlor, and I would go to school at night, and within 10 months, I learned to speak the language, and I was sailing across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris, France, where I was going to learn how to fly. But once I got there, the Carlton brothers, they closed the school. Not because I was a woman, not because I was a Negro woman, but because sadly, students had died the week before in a crash, and they were not sure if they would open the school again. Mr. Abbott was supporting me, but my money was running out. My time was long, but money was short. And finally, the school opened. I was one of 65 students. I was the only black woman in that class. But it did not matter. My classmates welcomed me. And there was one student by the name of Charlie. He was rather funny, because I told him that back home I picked cotton. And he says, well, Bessie, what is cotton? So I just looked at him and said, Charlie, you see the shirt you have on? I picked it before it was your shirt. And he finally got the idea. Now the day had come when I would finally learn to fly the aeroplane. And I would sit in that chair, and the plane would vibrate, and they would spin those propellers, and then I would suddenly take off, and I was soaring through the sky. I was flying, and I was free. And as I looked down onto the earth, why, I could see people look like little ants. It was wonderful being so high. I thought of my mama and my papa, how I wish they could be here with me. And as my plane lands and my feet are firmly planted on the ground, my spirit still soars high. But you see, I am now the world's first Negro in nature. I did not wish to keep this all to myself. I wanted to teach others how to fly. So as I sailed back home, I came up with the idea to open a Coleman Aviation of Flight School. But it was difficult because I did not have the money. I did not have the planes. So Mr. Abbott said I needed to do an air show. My very first show was September 1922 in Long Island. And there I would soar through the skies to show others all that I had learned. I would swoop and I would show them my skills, the super barrels, the eights, the barrels, the turns, the loop-the-loops. And my favorite was when I would dive to the earth and I would swoop over their heads and blow their hats off. I was flying. And so soon, Hollywood would come calling. They wanted to do the story about me and my life. But when I get there, they did not wish to do a story about me. They wanted to do a story about some docile female who had no ambition. I told them what to do with their movie. And now, while I was there in Los Angeles, a tire company would hire me to fly their banner on the back of my plane. And that is how I would make my living. But before I could really make a living, I would fly 1, 2, 300 feet and then crash to the ground. It would be 6 months before I would leave Los Angeles. When I opened my eyes, I had a broken leg, badly bruised ribs, and a badly bruised face. The doctor said that I would walk, but it would be a while. So during this time, I would go back to Chicago. Mr. Abbott decided that he no longer wanted to sponsor me. People began to say that I was a one-time thing, that I would never fly again. So I asked Mr. Abbott if he would issue one last statement. Tell them when I walk again, I will fly again. During my recovery, I received letters from dignitaries from all over the world. And I received one special letter from the Women's Welfare League in Jacksonville, Florida. They wanted to honor me, Bessie Coleman. So I told them I would be there. Did not have a plane, did not know where I would get one. But I would worry about that when I got there. Once I arrived, there were those who did not want me there. They would not lend me a plane, would not give me a plane, would not help me at all. So I called my friend William Wills in Texas, and I told him that I needed a Jenny plane. So he would fly the Jenny plane from Texas into Florida, but he had to set it down twice in Mississippi because of engine trouble. And while I was waiting for him to come, I would go from school to school, church to church. I would go wherever there were people, telling them to come to the fairground to see me because I was in town. And those who supported me, they would fly over the communities and drop out leaflets, telling them to come. So Wills finally made it, and we decided that we would rehearse. We were just going to taxi up and down the runway to see where I would do my jumps. And suddenly, I began begin to feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. I heard my mother's voice. She said, be somebody. I heard the word no. I heard women. I heard nigga. I saw those cotton fields, and you know, from up here, they're really quite beautiful. La femme encore vécu en Waka. Tu as voyagé par pavillon. You have never lived until you have flown.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give it to Tammy Denise one more time, please? She is ready to take one or two questions relating to the short enactment. Any questions from anybody?
How long have you been doing this? Do you do other acts besides Bessie Coleman?
Thank you. I portray 9 different women, and the women that I portray are the women you don't hear about. Society will have you think that Harriet, Frederick, and Martin did it all, so I choose to do the people that you don't hear a lot about, but was just as important.
So I did meet you in New London at the Hempstead House.
Yes, you did, Joan Jackson.
Okay.
Yes,
Very
I
well.
portrayed Joan Jackson.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Can you name the other women that you perform?
Yes, Sarah Margou, who is one of the children aboard the Amistad. As we've heard, we hear a lot about the legal case, but I like to bring the human face to the story. Most people do not realize there were 4 children aboard the Amistad. So Sarah Margou, I do Chloe Pratt. She was here in Connecticut when Washington was here and when the strategy that won the colonies their freedom was done at the Webb House Museum, and I actually work at that museum. Who else do I do? Elizabeth Keckley. She was in Lincoln's White House. Bessie Coleman, of course. I also do Belinda Royal. She is the woman who was taken from Ghana, spent 12 years in Antigua, and then taken to New Bedford, Mass. And she is the one that they use her story and her legal case as the basis for the reparations for the descendants of slaves. And I also portray Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman. There's a movie in the works about her. She's the first enslaved woman to get her freedom. She's known as the mother of civil rights, and because of her using the legal system to her advantage, slavery ended in Massachusetts, and 82 years later, her case was used, her argument was used as the basis for the Proclamation of Emancipation. How many is that? There's a couple of more. I have 2 more in production, but there is a movie in the works about Elizabeth Freeman, and Octavia Spencer has signed on to do her story. Yes. You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Well, I will be around for a little while longer if you want to ask afterwards, but thank y'all so much for your attention. I really appreciate it, and thank the Amistad Committee for having me back again this year. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. You might want to talk with Mr. Arnold Golick before you leave. He's the owner of Madison Art Cinemas. Denise, make sure you have a chat with him. Mr. Golick is the owner of Madison Art Cinemas. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, yeah, getting close to the end, but I've just been told that we still have food at the back. We have snacks. Please help yourselves. We don't want to throw anything away. If you are still eating, please go for more. Oliver Twist wants more. I don't know if you have left any other faculty members or staff from the university, but I know Miss Jane Gardner has been left out. inadvertently, but I want us to recognize her. She works at the Admissions and Registrar's Office. And I have to recognize all of our students that are here, undergraduate and graduate students. Please clap for yourselves. I think some of the concepts we have gathered here will be further discussed in our classes. Yeah, I would like to call on the director of the Center for Africana Studies, Making Everything Possible. She is professor of anthropology and the director of the center, under which Amistad Committee is seated. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Evelyn Phillips to give the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Amistad Committee for, again, putting on a great production and bringing a great scholar, Dr. Blyden. You did a excellent job in terms of the research and the depth, in terms of give us a lot more to think about. You know, the sad part that I think about this morning in my class, a student said, well, you know, African students don't know all of this about the African diaspora. They don't know that. But I'm saying a lot of students don't know about it. And the university has had this fight where the students have been asking to have more diversity in the courses. And that fight goes on. And I think this whole university should be aware of what is going on, because it is not just, you know, African history, African American history. It is world history that has tied us all together. And I think that hopefully next year that it will be an alumni hall, that the schools and everyone will bring people here, because it's so important, the work that the Amistad Committee is doing to, and in fact, we feel like we're in the margins trying to push forward to things in the center. And that task has to be opened up even more so. And the work that has been done has been remarkable. I would like to say that that what was so sad is looking at the Illinois commission that no longer exists. And there's so many issues that have to be addressed. And perhaps someone said the Commission on Amistad is not as strong as the need for children who are dying in the streets and all that. So it shows you the difficulties that we are experiencing globally throughout the world. But again, the battle goes on. I think if anything we learned from this presentation is that courage is so important. When you have an 11-year-old who said, make us free, you know, but also people who take up the responsibility of agency within themselves, not asking for someone else to free them, but freeing themselves collectively, and showing that together, the coalition of people throughout the world, that coalition is far stronger than those who try to divide us. I want to say that we have been fortunate. If you think about, we've been celebrating Ebenezer Bassett, who will become the first African descendant who have a building named after him, as March 20th at 6 p.m. I hope you mark that in your calendars and come and celebrate in Social Science Hall, which is one of the newest buildings on campus, will be named after Ebenezer Bassett. It's going to be a big occasion that the president's office is putting on. But that would not have been possible without the struggle of William Fothergill and the support from the community as well. So again, it's the unity of coming together. And then on March 21st, we will continue also having the conference, Africana Studies, and we are bringing back some alums who've gone on and done remarkable work. Chichi Obida, who is at Mercer College, graduated from our school. Now she's a PhD. She's done work at Yale and Harvard. So I think, again, we are trying to enlighten the community and move forward. And I want to, again, finally say, well done. Let's have more money, right, Chief? More money, because every time we are putting these events together. We are begging. Give me $1 here, give me $100 here. Why are we having to do that when this is such an important issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Please take note that the event for next year is on February 25th, and it's going to be at Alumni Hall. Put it on your calendar right away. So the place has been secured. Is on the 25th of February 2020. Amistad Lecture and Banquet will be at the Alumni Hall. If you do not get the flyer, please take note of the date. It's going to happen. And we look forward to seeing you. On behalf of my colleagues, Amistad Committee, if we do not have any further activities, I would like to draw the curtain. And let me take permission from my co-chair and members of the committee. All right. Thank you all. Thank you. See you next year.
Team meeting, I know.
Professor, these two ladies said they were going to do all my work for us.
Oh, did they? Okay, so.
I hope that's okay with you.
That's fine. I invite them to a class. So she denies you even have that discussion. Have a good night, everybody. Good night. Good luck with the rest of your class. Thank you. What do we have next week? Online. We know what we're doing online.
Wait, you forgot your autograph.
You already emailed me about that. Then when we come back,